Hello and welcome to Lab Roots, The Life of Her Mind, an interview series devoted to learning how women think about their research, their field, and their future. My name is Mia Wood. I'm a philosophy professor working at the intersection of philosophy and, well, everything else, especially the sciences. The first season of The Life of Her Mind originally aired in 2022 on Lab Roots' YouTube channel. Now, in 2025, I'm excited to announce that we're bringing the series back. The podcast will continue to explore the lives, careers, and minds of women in science across the globe. To reintroduce the series, we're representing our original episodes with updates for our listeners. In our third episode, Dr. Kisha Supernant, then Associate Professor at the University of Alberta, sat down to discuss her work. Dr. Supernant is an original contributor to the body of knowledge about Indigenous communities and Indigenous feminism. By recognizing and integrating different knowledge systems into archaeological practice, a more robust and accurate understanding of the archaeological record can emerge. So tune in to the third episode of The Life of Her Mind to learn what and how Dr. Supernant thinks. Let's find out about the life of her mind. For information on Dr. Supernant's work and links to resources, check out our show notes. Hello and welcome to Lab Roots, The Life of Her Mind, an interview series devoted to learning how women think about their research, their field, and their future. Let's get started. Today we are in conversation with Dr. Kisha Supernant, Director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta. Dr. Supernant is also co-director of Situated Knowledge's Indigenous Peoples and Place Signature Area and chair of the Unmarked Graves Working Group of the Canadian Archaeological Association. In addition, Dr. Supernant is the co-editor of Archaeologies of the Heart and Blurring Timescapes, Subverting Erasure, Remembering Ghosts on the Margins of History. In addition, Dr. Supernant is the author of numerous journal articles, book chapters, reports, and conference talks and presentations. Hello, Dr. Supernant, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
There is so much exciting work to discuss. It's hard to know where to start. For example, you are a groundbreaking archaeologist, a supervisor and mentor to graduate students, and an original contributor both to the body of knowledge about Indigenous communities and Indigenous feminism, and to the way we think about archaeology. So perhaps we can navigate to those by way of how you became an archaeologist. How did you get started?
Yes, my origin story. I became first interested in archaeology actively when I was a teenager, and my father actually was very much interested in all things esoteric, lost cities and ancient mysteries and that kind of thing. And he had turned me on to some of that literature. And I got really fascinated by the idea of spending my life traveling around and learning about the past and uncovering things that were no longer known. I was so enamored of it as a teenager that I really wanted to explore how to make it my future. And I had gone to my high school guidance counselor, and I was probably 14 or 15 at the time. And I was like, so I want to be an archaeologist. How do I go about doing that? It wasn't something that I think the guidance counselor heard every day. It was a pretty small school. But good for them. They found a little bit of information for me that basically said to become an archaeologist, you need to go to graduate school, get at least a master's, but ideally a PhD. Neither of my parents finished university. They both went for like a year and then dropped out. I had no concept of what a PhD was, but I decided then and there that that's what I was going to do. At the time, I was really interested in ancient civilizations, which I think for many of us is one of the pathways into archaeology. But throughout my educational career, I kept two things kept happening. One is I kept being drawn to work with Indigenous communities. I was in the Pacific Northwest. I went to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver for my undergraduate degree, and was very much in conversation with Indigenous communities, even in my undergrad. I was also on a journey of reconnecting at the same time. So I knew we were Indigenous, but my dad was raised in child welfare system and foster care. So we had no idea to whom we actually belonged growing up. So I was doing that at the same time as developing as an archaeologist. And eventually those two things really converged for me. And that's where a lot of this sort of generative work has emerged from.
When did you realize that the way that you think about archaeology is at least somewhat or entirely unique? I'm thinking not only about the worlds that you straddle as an academic, as a Métis community member, and as a woman, but also the way that you approach thinking about archaeology. I'm thinking about your sort of spatial and philosophical orientations.
Mm-hmm.
How did that, what made you realize this about yourself?
I think there's a number of moments which I can trace back to that help me understand the kind of lineage or origins of how I approach the discipline as a whole, both from a practice standpoint and from a more theoretical or philosophical standpoint. One of the most important moments for me was when I first did my archaeological field training, which was part of a field school run in direct collaboration with a First Nation in British Columbia. And this was in 2000. So it was before this was commonplace in many areas. And I had the opportunity to learn alongside community members. Like we were literally digging in the unit next to them, and they were sharing with me their understanding of their relationship to the past. And so that really planted an important seed to me and drew me back to doing more collaborative practice in my PhD work. But it wasn't working with my own ways of knowing and being. It was sort of broadly about Indigenous archaeology, but it was really coming home. So I now am in Edmonton, Alberta, which is my homeland. This is where my father was born. This is where my Métis family is from, this area of the world. And it had me coming here and coming back into direct relation with my living relatives that I think really helped me articulate what it meant to be a Métis archaeologist, right? And to be able to think about both that relational approach as well as what archaeology could be. And I think the spatial components to it, a lot of archaeologists are interested in things, right? The materiality of the past is a big draw. For me, it was never about the objects themselves. It was much more so about the relations between them, which now, of course, makes perfect sense to me as an Indigenous archaeologist that I was interested in relations between things. And so whether it was from when I first got to encounter stratigraphic drawings in my field school, which I became completely obsessed with, I loved them, and then getting into geographic information systems and mapping, and suddenly that made sense to my brain. Like it sort of this whole world opened up to me in terms of the spatial relations between people and land. And again, for me, this aligns really closely with an Indigenous approach where you can't separate out the objects from the people to whom they belonged, or from the land in which they're held for all this time until we re-encounter them as archaeologists. So all of these sort of things really coalesced for me when I was able to come and be in relation with what it meant to be a Métis woman and an archaeologist together. But I see those little threads all the way back to, little baby archaeologist Kisha as well. And they all were just able to really come together in a really amazing way.
A big part of that, I think, or at least as you nicely call it, part of your origin story, but more, I think, recent in your history. That is when you were you had begun working as an archaeologist, but you started hearing your ancestors speak to you. I wanted to ask you about that. In Blurring Timescapes, you rethink the concepts of ghosts and haunting to profound effect, particularly as it forces a reader, such as myself, to reconsider how we orient our attention and how we structure our beliefs. So just very quickly, going back to your point about objects and objectivity, someone like me, and not just because of, I think, my training in philosophy and the sort of philosophy in which I was trained, but also because of the culture in which I was born and raised, objectivity is really important, and thingness is really important, separate and apart from any relation, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, so as you develop this notion of haunting, like I said, it really has this profound effect. It seems obvious now that seeing from multiple points of view and thinking about ghosts and haunting, right, creates a much more complete picture of what there is and how we know it. But given that it sort of takes the haunting that you described for someone like me to think about that, how do you approach the concepts of ghosts and haunting when you're thinking about, let's say, writing for an audience of someone that includes people like me? And I'm thinking also, for example, about the fact that because my picture is incomplete, I and many people are ignorant of the steps that the US government and the Canadian government took to annihilate really Indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. So how did you get to ghosts and haunting, and how does that work for you to help someone like me?
Yeah, thank you for that really rich question. There's a few pieces I want to pull out from it. The first is the one about how ghosts and haunting kind of counter this idea of objectivity as separate from relation. One of the things I think I was always dissatisfied with as an archaeologist, as I was learning, was this separation of the object from not only the person, but also this idea that we study it only with our minds. Right, that there really is this sort of cerebral way in which we understand, measure, categorize, quantify these belongings from ancient peoples. And for me, the exploration of ghosts and haunting invites a much broader sensorial experience of archaeology, that it's not simply about the measurement and the category and the materiality of the object. It is about those other ways in which we encounter it. So there's an emotional component a lot of times to the archaeological work that we do. There's, for many people, not just me, a spiritual component, but we never talk about that. We talk about that around the bar at a conference where we tell ghost stories to each other, but we never make it part of our academic thinking. Mm-hmm. And for me, haunting is a really generative concept, because if you're being haunted by something, it's not forgotten. Just that's how I see it, right? So if something is forgotten, there is no haunting, because it wouldn't even be present at the corners of your perception. But a haunting means something is insisting that it must be remembered. So this sense of insistence, of recurring kind of encounters. And this is how I really relate this to erasure and annihilation of Indigenous peoples and communities. Both Canada and the United States are built on a premise that Indigenous people are gone, right? That was the fundamental founding premise. They operate a little differently because of the particular histories of those nations, but the core concept is the same, which is this settler population, this colonial population comes in and either erases or subsumes all Indigenous people under it, and we no longer exist as separate sovereign peoples. And my use of haunting, talking about sort of my encounters with ghosts and with Métis history, is that the haunting means we're attempted to be erased, but we are still here. And we are still demanding to be remembered in a particular kind of way. And in many ways, I would really see that haunting as a step toward the recognition of us as not just ghosts, but as still very much present here. But haunting can be a way down that, I think, for people who may not understand that we are still here. And even though we may live a lifestyle that is not that disparate from a lot of other people who live here now, although there's a lot of issues around that as well, and not having the same kind of access to things, but that the core of how we are in the world remains intact, right? Even with the history of boarding in residential schools, even with the kind of annihilation policies of the US government and of Canada, even with the history of disease and dispossession. We still have our way of life, and we still have our ways of knowing and being, and they are valid. They are valid ways of knowing and being. And to me, that's what haunting can kind of offer, is a way into understanding some of that history.
You mentioned the residential boarding schools. You have been a part of and initiated work on uncovering. I'm flabbergasted when I think about, if I'm not mistaken, the Saskatchewan school having closed as recently as 1997. But anyway, so you've used some techniques related to mapping. I don't know if they're GIS technique. You'll tell us what they are. But so you have uncovered, among other things, unmarked graves. You've located the site of graves of children who were at residential schools. You're trying to help people complete a picture of their own families, children who were ripped away from their families. How did that come about, and what exactly do you do with, what techniques are you using to help identify these areas?
It's really interesting to me that I've come to this place in my career. I had never been particularly interested in ancestors. It's another way for a lot of people to come into archaeology, is they're really interested in bones and human remains and that kind of thing. That was never me at all. But what really happened is, when you work with community, when you're standing alongside and working alongside community members, you build relationships of trust. And what started happening is communities would ask, can you help find unmarked graves? So I would be working with them, and we'd be doing things, we'd be in conversation, and they just kind of kept coming up in conversation. My background was in sort of digital archaeology, specifically around mapping, but a lot of the techniques that we use to locate potential unmarked graves are quite related. They're very spatial in their orientation. So it was a pretty easy way for me to kind of start to incorporate some of those methods into my practice in general, partly because they're non-invasive. So the methods we use there's a variety of them, but there's basically two main categories. There's forms of what we call remote sensing, which is understanding something about the Earth from afar, or there's what's called near-surface geophysics, which is techniques that use physical properties of the Earth to explore below the ground. And the ones that we particularly use when we're doing unmarked graves work are ones that are focused on the top, 10 to 12 feet of the Earth, because there's ones that'll go much, much deeper as well. So I had been working with communities on a variety of projects, and then this question of, can you help detect unmarked graves kept coming up. I also then had the wonderful fortune of connecting with a very talented graduate student who had come kind of trained with some of that knowledge, and we had access to the equipment, and we really started building our capacity. And this was before, in 2021, when the news from Tsimshian about the Kamloops burials started to emerge. We had already been doing this work for a few years, both around residential school sites, but there are other places where Indigenous ancestors are buried where we don't know where they are. There's lots of those too. So not just residential schools, but mass graves associated with the Spanish flu or with smallpox, or traditional burial places where we've been dispossessed and removed from our connection with those places. For example, I am a descendant of a group in Edmonton known as the Papaschase Cree Nation. We were supposed to have a reserve land in the southern part of the city. We were dispossessed of that in the 1880s, but one of our burial grounds is now in the middle of the city, but they don't know exactly where. So we were working with, I was working with my relatives to try to find where that might be, because we knew generally, but we didn't know specifically. And so using techniques such as ground penetrating radar, which is a near surface geophysics technique to map what's going on, really helps to bring more information about where these places might be located. Ground penetrating radar in particular has had a lot of attention over the past year because it was a technique used for the Kamloops Indian residential school work. What it really does is it sends an electromagnetic wave into the ground, like radar or sonar, but you're just pointing it down in the ground. And as the wave moves down, it hits what's underneath and bounces back to the antenna. When, say you have soil and there's a layer of soil and a layer of soil, it'll look different on the machine. And when that soil is disturbed, it will look different as well. So really what we're looking for when we're using ground penetrating radar is differences in the soil. And then we map them kind of in 3 dimensions. And when you find a disturbance in the soil that is the right size, shape, and depth that we might expect of a grave, then we say this could be a grave. It doesn't detect remains or anything, but it can help us understand locations that need to be investigated further.
So does this? So when you've made a possible identification, so you've identified an area for further exploration. Am I right to think that that's further exploration both by archaeologists, but also by an interdisciplinary effort, maybe looking at historical documents and interviewing community members, things like that?
It is very interdisciplinary. And so that can happen in sort of a number of different order, right? So we often go to historical documents and the history of land use and survivor knowledge first to help us know where to start to look. And then once we've narrowed that down and we found some results that warrant that further investigation, there's a few things that can happen. One, you can go back into some of those documentary evidence. You could work with the community. There's also potential for forensic investigation that some communities are exploring in order to get more information about who might be in that grave. And if it is, in fact, has remains in it. That is a whole different process. And no communities are really at that point yet, because it is a huge and very, very difficult undertaking on many, many levels, from both a scientific perspective, but from an emotional perspective. Mm-hmm. Even just what's happening right now with the locating of these potential graves is bringing up a lot of that trauma for survivors and communities, because we're still suffering from it as communities. The legacy of that is by no means gone, right? It's part of the reason there's so many issues that our communities are facing, because we've been ripped away from not only our families, but our way of life and our understanding of our place in the world for generations.
You're reminding me of the 2 things. One is the fact that on the one hand, the scientific undertaking is pretty darn recent. I mean, I don't mean this as a pun. It's pretty groundbreaking work, right? I know you're on the surface, so you're detecting certain superficially, not digging, but it is groundbreaking work. So it's new in that sense, and yet it's also the case that so much of this is enough in the recent memory, whether it's living memory or inherited memory, that it does take a fairly sensitive, multidisciplinary approach to deal with successfully. I mean, because I initially was thinking, I'll ask, so what happens once an individual has been identified? But you're saying, no, we're very far away from that. We're not at that point yet in multiple senses of that word.
Exactly. And even that question may never be fully answered because of there's so many factors that go into the science of it. And this has been one of the things I've found challenging in this work, is having to tell survivors who have questions and relatives who have questions that there's some questions that we can't answer with science. Mm-hmm. And there's some children who are likely lost to us forever. And I wish the science, in fact, were more sophisticated than it is. It's already, we have a lot of different techniques, mm-hmm. but survivors will share stories about things happening that we can't trace, and that can be really, really hard. But also, survivors also have knowledge, right? And it's also about I'm careful not to frame what we're doing as validating Indigenous knowledge. I think survivors and communities have known for decades that these children are buried in somewhere in the community, or they're gone, they've disappeared. This is just a process of being able to translate this for folks who aren't Indigenous sometimes, but also to provide that locational specificity. Like, here is the place we think this could be, to help the community then decide how to move forward with that.
There was a second idea that I had while you were talking a moment ago, but what you just said also reminds me of another question. So maybe I'll ask both, and you can choose what makes the most sense to you to answer. So first, you're thinking. So twice you've talked about place, right, location, and if I'm not mistaken, much of your original and continuing research is on the overwintering sites for the Métis people, and how. So I'm curious about how you do that work, especially given the fact that I would imagine some places have been developed, and how you go about locating those. But then the other part was speaking. I was wondering if you could speak to what you envision. So you did mention something about what you can say to families, to survivors, and what you can't, right? But what do you envision as like the best possible outcome over, let's say, the next I don't know, decade, 30 years? I'm not sure what a good time frame would be. What would you like to see?
Yeah, I might start with that one, and then I can move a little bit take us in a slightly different direction. I get asked this question a fair bit, and I guess for me, what the best outcome would be was the survivors having and the communities having the ability to determine what that is. That it's not kind of predetermined by, I can't go into a community and say, this is what I think the outcome should be for you, but I think it's really important for them to have the power to define that outcome. Right? To say, for our community, this is what we need. And for some, it's justice. It's a sense that someone needs to be held accountable. Someone needs to face the consequences of what they did to our children. So for some, that very much is what I hear. For others, it's that commemoration and memorialization. This idea that if those children can be remembered, no longer haunting, right? Coming back to that concept, but that they can be acknowledged and recognized as part of the community, and there can be ceremony, and there can be that healing component. So for some, it really is about, we need to know and tell this truth so that we can begin really that journey of healing. Mm-hmm. And then for others, it is really wanting to bring children home, like sending them to where, because residential schools took children sometimes from 1,000 miles away from home, right? Huge distances. And this idea that you need to send the children home in order for that healing to begin. But again, what pathway is right for which community is not something that I should say, and not something that a government should say, right? That needs to be given, that power needs to be given to communities. And I think there's different paths for different schools from different histories and different communities. And it is going to take, I would say at least a decade for any of this to get resolved. But the only way that this work is done is when the community says it's done.
Thank you.
Yeah. So overwintering. Overwintering sites have been the focus of a lot of my work on Métis archaeology. And I guess a few things for me that I love about Métis archaeology is, one, it's a relatively undefined field in which there was a bit of scholarship that happened in like the 1980s, but it hasn't really been a big topic of exploration by academics. And to the point that Métis communities in Canada today are not often considered as having an archaeological heritage. There's sort of this erasure of us in that, we're in the historical record, but people don't tend to connect that to the physical material places of the past beyond a few kind of core places. Like Winnipeg, Manitoba is the Red River settlement. That's like a core component to Métis identity. The area I live is also a really important kind of place in the Métis history. But we were lots of places, right? And we've been very much removed and disconnected from those places. So when I'm going and trying to understand our archaeological history, one of the reasons I was drawn to these overwintering sites is that they were kind of an important moment in time for the Métis and our sort of development as a people and a nation. But also they are very distinctly Métis. So what they are places where these large bison hunting brigades that Métis folks would form in the summer would go for the winter. So they'd go out from some of these major settlements, build their own little settlements out on the prairie in the parkland, in sheltered areas with access to wood, but also access to winter bison hunting. And these places were vast majority of people who lived there and created those places were Métis. Whereas at, say, a fur trade post, you've got Métis folks, but you've also got European settlers and you've got First Nations. And so it's a bit more complex from a material perspective. So I was initially drawn to overwintering sites as a place to sort of evaluate what Métis sites kind of looked like. Mm-hmm. Now, many of them have been impacted by development, but there are also places where there's a fair bit that remains intact. So choosing a few of those where we could get kind of a baseline understanding of what Métis materiality looked like was really the goal of that. And then from that, you can take that kind of patterning, that understanding of Métis materiality, and start to look elsewhere. So earlier this year, I actually gave a paper around rereading fur trade archaeology, which in Canada is sort of the bulk of historical archaeology, especially in Western Canada, is all on kind of fur trading posts from the 17 and 1800s. But there's almost never any real mention of Métis people in those accounts. Ironically, we built every fur trade post basically in Alberta and Saskatchewan and like huge amounts of these places, really almost entirely across Western Canada. They were created by us and by our ancestors who became us in many ways. And yet we're not present in the literature at all, in the archaeological literature. And so I went back to a bunch of these old reports and started looking for the patterns that I knew were associated with Métis people, and then how the archaeologists writing them kind of explain away some of those patterns without really considering that they might be, that pile of beads over there might not be a First Nations woman. That very well could be a Métis woman, but you don't talk about that, right? Mm-hmm. Or if it's not a Métis woman at the time, certainly someone who then likely gave birth to people who would become Métis, right? Because we sort of have these collected interwoven community networks and family networks that help to sort of form us as a people. So for me, there was this really important piece around the materiality can provide a different understanding, again, not for our people so much, but for everyone else, about where we were and the kind of richness of our material history, and help to tell our story, which is ultimately what we want to be able to do.
And you've talked about being guided by interest in identity as one of your interests. And I was thinking about that with respect to the ways that what we choose to focus on that then becomes another's identity. So, for example, looking at beads and identifying it as one thing to the exclusion because you hadn't considered some other possibility. Mm-hmm. So, when you talk about being interested in identity, are you thinking about this very special thinking about identity let me back out of that. When you're thinking about identity, are you thinking about identity in terms of relationships or identity in terms of like, okay, here's a discrete object that's separate from everything else? That kind of goes back to that objectivity issue.
I would say that if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, my answer would have been closer to the latter than the former, which was that I think when I first was encountering the kind of theoretical body of work of identity, which was definitely an interest, which, of course, I always think about how this relates to me and the sense that I didn't know my identity really and what that meant. And so I became really fascinated with studying it because then it was something I could try to understand. But very much, I would say now, my understanding of identity is one that is deeply relational and intersectional. So it's not so much that, this is a Métis object because it is inherently. It's about the relations to place, to ways of knowing, to family, to kinscape, which is a term that I find really evocative, this idea of the relationship between place and kin relations. And that can be kin both in terms of humans, but other than humans as well. And this idea of this sort of intersecting web of relations. So for me, identity kind of emerges from those relations. And this is really important when it comes to Métis people, because for a long time, and in many ways still, there's been this way of identifying us as being of mixed European and First Nations descent in Canada. So that is really the fundamental quality of what it means to be Métis.
Mhm.
But there are lots of people who are mixed, who are not Métis.
Mhm.
There's lots of First Nations folks who might have a white grandfather or even parent, and they're still Cree or Blackfoot or Anishinaabe. So it's not so much that there's a fundamental mixedness that lies at our heart, but it's more so there was this history of families. So our origin story is ones of, yes, there was Indigenous women and European men who had children, but then those children tended to marry children from similar unions for generations. So if you look at my family tree, I have like 4 or 5 generations of Métis people marrying other Métis people and really creating a sense of community and identity that was about that relation and about the relations to the places where we were as well. And this is, for me, how I have come to really understand identity. And it's also why I struggle when sometimes you have folks who are have one Indigenous ancestor, the Cherokee princess model in the US, but here it's very much like, oh, I have an Indigenous ancestor, that makes me Métis. Well, no, that doesn't. What makes you Métis is that history of relation. And I couldn't fully be Métis until I was back in relation with that. And because it's not just about I am, related to, it's about the responsibility of that relation. It's about being a good relation, right? Being able to work for the community and support telling our story, not just claiming, but being claimed by that community as well.
And that reminds me of some of what I've read, but also what you've mentioned, this notion that there are lots of voices to be heard and who can help to create the full picture of whatever story you're trying to learn or trying to understand. So yeah, that's incredibly helpful to thinking about what it is that you're doing. I know that your time is valuable. I've got one more question, if I may. And of course, I want to know if there's something that you would like to share with viewers and listeners. First, the question, there's a territorial acknowledgement on the University of Alberta web pages. And I'm wondering what this sort of acknowledgement does for Indigenous communities, as well as for those of us who have spent so much of our lives in complete or partial ignorance of the reality of these voices and this history and this identity.
I think we've seen a significant increase in the use of land acknowledgements, especially in North America, as a way of, again, bringing forth some of that history of, these are the traditional territories, of a particular nation or set of nations. Edmonton, where I'm located, is a particularly interesting one because it has many nations who have a connection in history here, and that it's always been kind of a gathering and meeting place, a place of coming together. So we have a lot of nations listed on our territorial acknowledgement, but other places are very clearly connected to a history of a particular Indigenous nation. I've heard critiques, certainly, of land acknowledgements in that they are just words, right? This idea that, do they actually lead to any concrete action? And I think in many ways that is a valid critique and can be quite performative, right? This where we do this just because we've been trained to do it now, or we've have it in our signature line because that was on our university website. At the same time, I've spoken with a number of elders who really, it's so valuable to them that that's happening, because they grew up in a time where they were completely erased from these spaces, certainly from universities. It wasn't something that was very present, 30, 40 years ago. And therefore, that acknowledgement really makes them feel seen, right? And again, sort of taking from that realm of haunting to actually that corporeal realm of like, this is traditional territory. And the one in the University of Alberta also tries to talk about, the kind of vibrant community that's still here. So it's not just about was the traditional territory, like this is the traditional territory. And there are these people still here and still contributing to the community. So I think that it's a step along a path of, remembering and then trying to account for the lands in which many of these institutions sit, which were stolen from Indigenous people and sometimes very actively played a part in dispossession. So I think it's important as a step toward understanding that, but it is not in and of itself enough. Right? It brings more into the conversation, but it can't be the ending place of this. It has to be the starting place of a journey to really understand and think about what does it actually mean to account for that history as well.
Well, I want to know if there's anything that you're working on, or that you're thinking about, or that you would like to mention to our viewers before we sign off. But before that, I want to thank you again for your time. It has been a real privilege and a pleasure. Thank you for making time to chat with us today.
I was really happy to be here. I think the only thing that I would want to bring up a bit that we didn't really touch on is a lot of what I've talked about in this conversation today is really well summed up by the heart-centered archaeology that I have worked with some dear friends and colleagues on. So the book Archaeology of the Heart, which I co-edited with Sonia Adelaide, Natasha Lyons, and Jane Baxter, was really our attempt to take some of these principles, some of which are connected to Indigenous archaeology, some sort of feminist archaeology, but they're fundamentally about inviting a different way to be an archaeologist and to do archaeological work. Mm-hmm. So it's as much about how we care for each other in the present, because archaeology has had a very ugly history of violence toward all kinds of different people. And the nature of the discipline has been one that's been very exclusionary, that's done a lot of harm, both in terms of what we've extracted from the ground, but also in terms of how we've treated one another as archaeologists. So it's our invitation to be more expansive, to invite in emotion, to invite in that sense of care, but to remain with a strong commitment to doing excellent, high-quality work. That it's not having an emotional connection to something doesn't actually reduce our ability to use excellent scientific methods. In fact, it improves my science when I care. Mm-hmm. And I am not going to tell an Indigenous community that I found an unmarked grave when I haven't. That would be so deeply unethical to me. So I have to really do the best science I can. And those things are actually deeply interconnected. And then that relational piece. And we need to be good relations to the belongings of ancestors of the past, but we also need to be good relations to one another. So to work against the sort of hierarchical models and those power dynamics, mm-hmm. to recognize and respect them, to be more collaborative and community oriented, even in how we run our lab, how we work with students. And so for me, this is it's a wonderful way to kind of take some of the principles that I see at the core of Indigenous archaeology, but also connect them in with other similar movements, right? Other similar ways that people are thinking about archaeology and what it can and should be globally, right? Because it's this idea that we want to create a space where any archaeologist with a heart can practice heart-centered archaeology. And that was our invitation really in the book.
What, so one more time, HEART is an acronym for?
Yeah, heart-centered. I have to remember how we did it. HEART, I remember. Heart-centered and emotional archaeologies for research and teaching. HEART is the acronym, and it's this collective of women at this point. It's majority women who are really sort of thinking through and feeling through a lot of this. And we've had an amazing response to the book itself and to the work of heart-centered practice, because especially a younger generation of archaeologists from all sort of genders and backgrounds, I think, have been looking for an approach. So even if their interests are in a very different realm than, say, Indigenous archaeology, they want to do archaeology differently. And they want to do archaeology that really matters, that has a positive contribution in the world today in a very direct way. So not just archaeology for the sake of knowing the history of humanity, but archaeology for addressing the history of colonization or for telling different kinds of stories. And I see such an amazing generation of archaeologists emerging who are going to really lead us in all kinds of new and amazing directions. It gives me a lot of hope.
Oh, that's a wonderful note on which to end. And I will make sure that we have a link to, is there a HEART website, or can folks get to that through your faculty or?
Yeah, they can. I mean, I would direct people to the book first, as well, and then we've been talking about a website, but we don't have one yet. So
We'll make sure we have a link to the book. Thank you so much once again. I appreciate your time and your work. You're very generous, and thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, it was great talking with you.
Since our 2022 interview, Dr. Roden has published a large number of articles in her field, has served on high-level planetary groups and committees, and has focused recent research efforts on the Saturn system. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to everything Dr. Roden's been working on, and see you next time on The Life of Her Mind when we talk to Dr. Kisha Supernant, a groundbreaking scientist revolutionizing the way we think about archaeology.